Hello, I am Bradley Goodfellow. It has been a while. May turned out to not be too great of a month. We'll just put it that way. Hope everybody's doing all right this evening. We today are going to begin creating a D&D setting. Now, I am going to be using books from a specific edition. However, the vast majority of the things that I am going to be doing should translate to just about any version. Just about. Even some of the things that are very version specific still translate to most of the other editions fairly well. I can't speak too much about fourth because, I mean, let's face it, fourth was bad. I mean, um, but most stuff should transfer. And even the things where I am using very specific edition books, these books are good reference material no matter what edition you're using. They have all kinds of information and fluff and such that is kind of important to understanding how some of this stuff works. So therefore is going to be very useful to making it. Now this is probably whoa, I jumped around there for a second. This is probably going to be a multi-stream thing. It is not going to be done tonight. All right, we're going ground up here. We're starting from nothing and creating an entire campaign setting. And as I go, I will give tips and tricks for doing so yourself, some advice for aspiring and existing DMs, including including common pitfalls that DMs tend to not recognize as pitfalls. That's kind of an important thing. And you might be wondering, what in the world, Brad, what in the world makes you think that you have any idea what you're talking about? And the answer to that question is that I have been playing D&D since I was 9 years old and running campaigns since not too long after that. I am in my 40s now, so I have over 30 years of experience with this. That is the level of experience where if it were a job, you would be considered an expert. I don't necessarily say I'm an expert, but I am very experienced. So, with that in mind, I also acknowledge the fact that I'm not perfect. There are still going to be things that I do that I might not recognize as flaws. But there are very much things that I have seen repeated time and time and time again that just cause problems. And we'll get into that. We'll get into that as I go. I probably won't even cover a fraction of it tonight. I think at most I have 3 hours in me. Maybe it'll be more like two. I don't know. We're not going to get very far. But that is because I am going to go over the many, many different starting points that you can have when you're creating a setting. There's a handful that I like to use. I'm still not entirely certain which spot I'm going to start at. I've actually had to run down and grab my books because I forgot, while the music was playing because I forgot them. Um, and yeah, so that's a thing because I wasn't quite sure. Put on a little bit more medievally type music here. All right, so let's go ahead and we're going to switch over to my newly created special D&D world creation screen. And you will immediately, when I switch over, be treated to which edition I'm using. If any of you have followed me on Twitter, you probably know All right. Let's go. All right. We are here. We have my AD&D 2nd edition world building screen. I got this nice parchment background. It does tend to wash my model out a little bit, but I feel like the parchment is the appropriate background, so we're going to stick with it. Yeah, I mean, it's what's here. I still have my follower goal up. I just moved it up into the corner there, way up there. That way it's going to be pretty much out of the way of whatever we're doing. I've got, of course, up up in the top center, AD&D 2nd edition world building. Beautiful. I have a bunch of stuff set up and ready to go. Let me actually do this real quick. Now this did not turn out as good as I would have liked, but it's going to have to suffice for the moment. And let me just type something real quick here. There you can see. This way I can just note stuff down and have it visible to you guys. As you can see, there's still like, I don't know, I haven't been able to get the chroma key working on this quite perfect, and unfortunately I kind of ran out of time futzing with it. So it is as good as I'm getting it for now. And that was a very short piece of music. There, do that. Okay. I don't know that I'm going to stay on top of the music this whole time or not, but probably not. Okay, so we also have. Let me pull it up here. There. This is Campaign Cartographer 3. This is a very old version of the software, and it is. Don't mind me, I'm just having to swat at the cat. I believe the software itself has actually changed names now, but the version I have, it was still called Campaign Cartographer. This will be useful for making world maps and such. As you can see, there's all kinds of little stuff along the sides here, and all kinds of stuff along the sides over there, and just kind of generally good stuff. Good stuff. So we'll be able to futz with that when it is time to do world map stuff. Beyond that, I have a couple of things here. I actually, I have a D&D logo because I used that for the picture on my tweet saying, "Hey, I'm going live." And I have images of some of the books we're going to be using. So to start with, since it is AD&D 2nd edition that I am primarily making this for, we have the AD&D 2nd edition Player's Handbook. Yep, that version of it, right there. You see that book? You see that cover? You know that's the book I'm using. Similarly, there is one other very useful 2nd edition book, and this is one that I am going to say, like I had kind of intimated earlier, that even if you are using a different edition, even if you are doing stuff that is not, 2nd edition, that is not, this is going to be a book that you're going to want regardless, and that is the Priest's Handbook. Now, this is one of those things where it's called a player's guide, but in actuality, this is a book for DMs. Some of the 2nd edition books were like that, where it's like, oh, here's a bunch. This is a book for players, and then you crack it open and get into it, and you're like, oh, this is all stuff that DMs really need when they're making settings. And this is probably the book that is the most like that. That being the Priest's Handbook. Let me just kind of keep just that one up there for the moment, so we know which one I'm talking about if anybody comes in. Yeah, this book primarily is about building priests of specific faiths and the gods they follow, and the pantheons that those gods belong to. So you can see all three of those things are things that the DM needs to do in advance. All kind of things that are important to the world setting. And you also kind of it's good reference for the player when the DM hands them the thing and says, "Oh, you want to be a priest? You want to be a priest of this god? Well, they have these are the things that you need to know about the priest," and they hand them the big information on that particular god's priests, and they're like, "Oh, these are the things they observe, and these are the spells they get access to, and yada yada yada." And so you open up the priest's handbook and you're like, what do these things mean? So it's useful for the players there, but only because it was useful for the DM first. So yeah, this is very important. You want to have gods in your setting, you want this book. Pretty much all there is to it. So let me go ahead and take that off the screen there. We're not necessarily starting there. Like I said, I haven't exactly figured out which direction we're coming at this first, but let's go ahead and just kind of do a little bit of this. So, all right. Ways to... Wait a minute. Why did this... Ways to start building... yeah. Building a setting. All right. That looks terrible on my screen. Let me... Ugh. All right, let me just futz with this a little bit. Give me a moment here to just kind of try and mess with this a little. See if I can't... Whoa, what in the world did I do? Oh, hang on. I've done something. Hang on. What did I do? Where did it go? Why? Where are you? Why are you not... Uh-oh. I've lost it. I've lost it, chat. Well, that's a little bit of a problem. That's not what I wanted. Bueller? Properties. Yeah. Yeah. Do the thing? Anything? Well, that's troublesome. Hmm. Let's just put that on real quick. Why are we not... Hang on. What is going on here? All right. I have completely lost this. I might have to set this up all over again. Oh, okay, there we go. All right, I got it. I fixed it. Now to try and futz with the chroma key thing. A little bit. Hmm. No. Okay. Contract. Maybe? That's still not great. That is still not great. Hang on a sec. Let me see if I can try this a different way. Hmm. Let's try. Can I? All right, hang on. Tell you what. Give me just a minute here while I futz with this. See if I can get this working a little better. All right, it's not gonna work. It's not gonna get any better. All right, all right. Let's just kind of deal with this as it is. Okay, so let's stick this out as much as we can. All right, so we have multiple different ways we could go about building a setting. So we can start with the Pantheon, as I kind of implied. We could start with the Pantheon. We could start with the world map. That's a possibility. We could. I mean, those are generally my two preferred ways. I'm just going to say that right now. One of those two is generally my preference. We could start with kingdoms. Without even making a map, we could decide I want a kingdom that is this, a kingdom that is that, a kingdom that is this other thing. You know, I want them to be primarily like this, and then move on to go, all right, what kind of pantheon do I need to have all of these in the same setting? Or what kind, how do I set the land, maps up so, so that these kingdoms are going to be stable in the way that I have them in their relations to each other. Dropping the evil kingdom right next to the goody two shoes kingdom probably isn't going to be a very stable environment. You need some sort of buffer, even if it's just an ocean, that type of thing. Kind of important to figure out, which is kind of why I prefer to go with the world map first, because then I can look at areas and see what kind of natural barriers I have put in, and that kind of gives me good guidelines for where to put kingdoms, things of that nature. So there we go. We got 3 so far. Let's see. Are there any other ways we could do this? You could, in theory, go with a greater universe perspective and start there. Be like, this is what the area outside their world is like. Because keep in mind, while it's not necessarily a preferred thing for most players, Spelljammer exists, which is the entire thing of like the whole crystal spheres, the the multiple worlds inside a crystal sphere, the collections of crystal spheres, how far they are from each other, the traveling world to world, or even to some things that aren't worlds, that sort of stuff. Medieval space age, type stuff is possible. So if you decide you want to have stuff going on like that, I once made a setting. It wasn't for D&D, but I did once create a setting where the greater universe was a very important part of the founding of the setting, like the concept of the setting, because it got cut off from the remainder of its like normal multiverse, which basically meant that the pantheon that was there was this mismatch of gods that happened to have been there at the time it got cut off, and things that developed there because of that. You kind of go down that line and be like, all right, well, there were things like, oh, there's vampires, but they're not the normal vampires, because there were no normal vampires in this setting when it got cut off in the multiverse, but there were still the stories of vampires. So somebody made something that was, based on the idea of a vampire, and they got called vampires, so it was some things like that. So going with the how is the greater universe impact the setting as a start, not necessarily a popular choice, but one I have used in the past, so it is a viable option. What else? What else could we do? I'm sure there's more ways to do this. I just need to rack my brain a little bit. I only prepared a little bit for this stream. I kind of knew generally where I wanted to go with it, but was kind of relying on my own uh, experience as a thing to fall back on when we got into the nitty gritty like this. So let's see. There's the greater universe, Pantheon, world map, kingdoms. You can go, notable individuals. Now keep in mind, all of these things, even though I've got this listed as where to start building, these are all things we are going to have to cover before our setting is complete. Just gonna be said. So notable individuals. This is your Gandalf the Grey, your Elrond, your I'm trying to think of some of the other ones that aren't Lord of the Rings. Why is my brain suddenly all Lord of the Rings? These are your people of note that are generally some sort of high level character that exists in the setting, or somehow otherwise important. Things like kings. You might want to be like, all right, well, this is a king. Is he a warrior king? Is he a puppet head for the nobles of the kingdom that is basically just there to rule in name only? What is he? What is this person? Which obviously something to consider under kingdoms, but you could start there when you're building, because you could be like, all right, well, I know that I want, a strong, powerful king, a weak king that is king in name only. I want to have a power mad emperor. I want to have a simple-minded sultan, and be like, all right, here's a collection of leaders. Now I need to go. What would their kingdoms look like based on these attributes I have set for them? Because if you a strong leader, a strong moral leader is going to generally have a different kingdom than a weak moral leader, or a strong immoral leader, or even just a moral leader that is fairly simple. Yeah, that they're not necessarily very smart. Their people respect them. They're strong in their position, but they're not too bright. They're moral, but they're not bright. So a lot of stuff will fly under the radar in that type of, in a kingdom ruled by such an individual, unless he happened to luck into, some particularly good subordinates that are loyal. Then that might also be things that help. And if they are particularly good subordinates, those are notable individuals too. So it is entirely possible to start building your entire setting around a mishmash of notable individuals. Entirely possible there. Just like notable individuals, powerful artifacts. You might want to start and be like, I want to see a foundation of these particular artifacts. I'm a Gloryhammer fan, so there is a powerful, dire hammer that, can only be wielded by individuals it chooses, and, blah, blah, blah. You could go in that direction and be like, it is the Astral Hammer, you know. forged in the heart of a neutron star, all that sort of jazz. You could do that, and then you can go from, all right, so here's like this selection of like 6 powerful artifacts that exist in the world. How did they shape the world that they are in? Because you don't even necessarily have to go with how were they created, who created them, when were they created, all important things you might want to know. But you could just go, these things exist. People know about them. Maybe they're not constantly in use, but if there are legends about them, what did those items do to the world when they were in use? You could start there, and you could end up with like, oh, there are these really powerful weapons out there. I'm going to put in some destroyed kingdoms and a wasteland that can no longer support life because it was completely burned out of it by one of these powerful artifacts. That's a perfectly viable place to start building your setting. Just be like, these are these powerful things. How have they been used? What effect has that had on the setting? What are we looking at now because of the past use of these things? Have members of the Pantheon been killed by these artifacts? You see, it's one of these things where all of these things are things you need to consider. It doesn't necessarily matter which one you start with. Just you got to keep in mind, how does each one affect all of the others? And I'm going to say that multiple times. I'm going to say that many, many times before we are done here. So, all right. So we've got gods, we've got the world, we've got the kingdoms that inhabit the world, we've got the greater universe that the world itself is in. We've got people that populate the kingdoms. We've got powerful items that might be in the kingdoms. This is a pretty good start. This is a pretty good overview. I'm trying to think if I've missed anything. Let me just take a moment here, put on another piece of music, because I have once again kind of run out of something there. that's too short. I was gonna click one, but it was a minute and a half, and I'm like, nope, that's not gonna be. Um, maybe that one. Okay. So let's see. We've got. Let me think about this from that other side. That the what all sorts of things do you need to consider? Oh, I know. Important locations. And you might be like, oh, you could just add that on the world map. And yes, you absolutely could. Or you could go about it the other way. You could be like, all right, I need some important locations. What are the places of note, of particular note? And I'm not just talking about like, oh, it's the palace of such and such a kingdom. Important location, yes. Not what I'm referring to here. I'm talking about things like Stonehenge or the pyramids. The things that might be the wonders of the world that have, because it's a magical setting, have some sort of magical importance. Or even just things like here is this particular battlefield. Hundreds of wars have been fought over this battlefield. And, there are countless corpses buried here because it happens to lie in a spot, like maybe it's a mountain pass, a mountain, like a particularly broad mountain valley that is the only real, like, viable place that people could pass between two kingdoms that regularly go to war, you know, things like that. And you might be like, all right, well, what kind of effect might that have? And why might some sort of place like that be important? And well, obviously the first thing that comes to my mind is, well, if there have been hundreds of wars and countless bodies here, well, that sounds like the kind of place a powerful necromancer might try to get to raise an army. Something like that. And that could even inform, like, stuff that's going on. Which, let's go ahead and just kind of go there. Stuff that's going on. You might be like, that's a kind of a dumb place to start. And I'll say, yeah, you might be onto something there. But we're going to start touching on some of the traps that DMs commonly fall into when we talk about this. Too many DMs, far too many DMs, go into running a game with the idea that they are telling a story and that the players are just characters in their story. This is a mistake. If you are playing a real game, not just something that, like, I'll poke at Critical Role here. Critical Role has made this problem more common. Because for Critical Role, it's a bunch of people that are getting together, they're making something that is good to watch. But what is good to watch is not always what is good to play. And I'm going to say that right there. It's not necessarily that it is not good to watch. It's just that that type of thing is not good to play. You don't want there are many very common turns of phrase that refer to aspects of this problem. The most common that people would know is railroading. This is where a DM, a GM, a storyteller, whatever the person that kind of runs the setting is called in whichever type of game you're playing, where they basically force the plot, where this thing is happening, You can't do anything about it. You're here to witness this thing happening. Or even worse, things like this thing is happening. No, you have to go and do this thing. That's the even more blatant version of it. It's like, nope, nothing else that you can do is remotely viable. This thing has to be done in this way, and that's the only way because that's how I'm telling my story. And that is one of the biggest red flags for someone running a game. You do not want to be that guy. So when I'm talking about stuff that's going on, like stuff that's going on, that right there, I am not, absolutely not advocating for you to write the story. Tabletop role playing is a collaborative storytelling experience. We'll circle back to what the role of the DM actually is, but what I am talking about here first is literally just that stuff that's going on. You'd be like, all right, and this will, of course, touch on all kinds of these other things that we have been talking about. Because, things that are happening, it tend to involve notable individuals, important locations, maybe powerful artifacts. They're going on in kingdoms, which have a place on the world map. Maybe it's being done in the service to a member of the Pantheon. Or maybe somebody's trying to get out to look at parts of the greater universe. All of these things are interconnected, which is why you can pretty much start with any of them. But what I'm talking about here are things like, let's look at some existing stories. Things like Aladdin. Got a royal vizier who really wants to take over the kingdom. Just kind of keeps getting subtly thwarted through no fault of his own. It's something the PCs could eventually go and look at if they're even in that part of the setting. But it should never be something they're compelled to start. Now, that is different from having consequences for actions or inactions if they do poke at it. That's a completely different thing. If they, start the process of taking down the royal vizier and then fuck off and do something else before they actually wrap things up, well, stuff is still going to happen while they're gone, But that's consequences of actions, not railroading. There's a very important distinction. Wow, my throat is already getting sore, and it has not even been an hour yet. All right, let's press onward. Other examples of stuff that's going on. A thieves guild, really wants a particular artifact that, they happen to know the location of, but they just don't have the manpower to get it done. Or conversely, maybe they did, and they have, and they have come into the possession of something. Or maybe it's even just like, oh, they stole the crown jewels, they're now trying to ransom it back. These are not things that the players are going to be compelled to get involved in, but they might decide to get involved in them. And these are not small events either. You notice the fact that everything I have mentioned are not small little things like, oh, my farm got run over by kobolds. No, it's not little stuff. This is big stuff. These are all the kinds of things that you might even actually form a campaign around. But the important, and I cannot stress this enough, the important thing is to make all of this stuff optional. Optional. And I'll say it one more time. Optional. The free will, player agency is what it is called. The idea that what the players choose to do or not do actually lies in their hands. That is one of the most important things for any DM to keep in mind. You do not take away player agency outside of very, very specific situations. Things like things where there are hard and fast rules. For example, you'd be like, okay, you you can't climb the sheer ice wall without tools because the book flat out says you can't. That is not a possible role. You have to have tools to climb that sheer ice face. Things like that. That is different because it's look, I can point to it right here. I'm not making it up. It says it right here. Look, you can't do it. That is not really robbing a player of their agency. That is just kind of be like, nope, sorry, cold hard fact of the universe. Can't do anything about it. It's literally written down in the rules. You kind of got to respect that type of thing. But things like, oh, you guys are, uh, walking up to the gate and, oh, there goes some noble looking guy with a noble looking woman tossed over his shoulder riding on a horse out of town. Okay. Players could choose to do nothing. And you need to be able to keep running your game if the players choose not to do anything. You need to be able to continue running the game if the players shoot that nobleman dead on a single lucky shot and not have it just completely derail your entire game session. You need to be prepared for both options. Sometimes the players aren't going to be interested. Sometimes the players will hyper focus in on some tiny little thing that wasn't important at all when you originally wrote it down, but now you got to deal with it because that's what they're focused on. These are the kind of things that happen. And you gotta learn to fly by the seat of your pants, which I think is probably the most important part there. All right, so that I think about covers the various ways you could start building your setting. And what you need to do is you do need to go through all of these. You might be able to skip Greater Universe. If you don't intend on having anything that involves anything beyond the world you are on, you can choose to skip that one. But that is literally the only one out of this entire list that you could actually afford to skip. So, these are actually kind of listed in the order I would think that they would be important. Maybe notable individuals might be up a little higher. Kind of questionable whether that should be there or if you should stick that like to one side or the other of kingdoms. But other than that, I mean, obviously, it's also going to kind of depend on what your inspiration strikes. Because, like, if your inspiration strikes with, powerful artifacts, like, oh, there are these, uh, far-seeing orbs that exist in the setting, and political scandals have, blah, 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 many times throughout history when people get their hands on them. And, something like that. If that's where you want to start, that's where you want to start. So we're there. All right. Let's take a quick peek. Where do we actually want to start? I kind of want to start at Pantheon, We could go world map, because I do have a campaign cartographer pulled up. We could start there, because that can inform so many other things, even the gods. Because it might be things like certain gods are worshipped in certain areas, and what type of god they are is based off of the type of environment of their worshippers. You know, that's an entirely viable method as well. Do I want to start with? All right, let me poke around here with campaign cartographer a little bit. Let's poke at it a little bit. I need to try and remember how to do this. It has been a minute. I think. All right. I seem to recall. C. Uh. Oh. That's not useful. Escalator. Oh, thanks. All right. Let's see. Standard. No, wait. Hang on. Hollow. Right, it's land, sea, rivers, drawing tool, contour sea, roads, sea, style default, city, overland, forest mix. I'm trying to remember because I know there's a way for me to just add the ocean and then put the land in over top. Catalog setting, no. Mountain. No, I'm trying to remember this. Like I said, it's been a minute. It's a really useful tool. It has just been several years since I've used it. See. See light. Can I just... Um... Alright. I don't think I'm doing this right. Nope. Alright, hang on. I have done something wrong here. There is... Nope, that's all... Reef. Rocks at sea. I kind of remember this whole thing starting out as just ocean. Draw. Fill with symbols. Um, Coast? No. No, maybe not. All right. Yeah, I feel like maybe I lost a file or something because I really feel like the ocean should have been loaded in already. Hmm. Something might be wrong with this. Symbols. Landmass, lake, rivers, roads, borders, terrain. Yeah, I feel like... Alright, let's just kind of... Yeah, this is supposed to have stuff in it. Something. My thing might be corrupted. That would suck. I really wanted to use this. Alright, I guess we're not going to start with the land then. Yeah, let's just... Yeah, no, don't save. Okay. I'm going to have to look at that between, and hopefully we'll be able to get to it after the second one. Alright. So... That is all that. Let's, We're going to shrink this down a little bit. Doot, 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 doot. Hopefully you guys can still read it just fine like that. And, alright, so let's go ahead. We're going to start on some stuff. So we're going to start, I suppose, instead. We're going to start with the Pantheon. Alright, so we are going to need a handful of gods. We're probably going to need anywhere from, say, 6 to 12 gods, goddesses. You generally want a roughly even mix of the two. You need to sort of figure out what things they have. And now, okay, we're going to go ahead, since we're talking about this. Boop. Here we go. We're going to talk about the Priest's Handbook. I have my copy actually physically in my hand. Alright, so, reading from the Priest's Handbook, let's see. Designing Faiths. Starts with page 11. So that tells you just how early this is. Alright, here we are. Mythic History Creation Sheet. Ooh. Alright, so page 10 here of the Priest's Handbook is the Mythic History Creation Sheet. So it's got creation. How was the universe created? What is the shape of the world and universe? What are suns, moons, planets, and stars? Characteristics of the gods. Are the gods immoral? Are the gods indestructible? How much direct influence do they have? How much interest do they have in the world? What are their intentions toward the world? Does anything inhibit them? Humans, humanoids, animals, plants, how are they all created? Fall from grace. Did the sentient races fall from grace? If so, how? The challenge. What is the afterlife believed to be like? The future. Are there any legends about the future of the world? The pantheon. Who are the main gods and what are their attributes? And then it's got, a little section here for god and attribute. Events. What are the main legends known to the player characters? And that is the Mythic History Creation Sheet. These are all very important things for a setting. I will actually have to see if I can get an image of that particular sheet for the next session, because I haven't actually cracked this book open in a while. I just kind of remembered it being real useful in some of the stuff that's in here. All right, so I'm going to just kind of hit some of the important points here. For each faith you establish in your campaign world, you have to decide what it is that is being worshipped and venerated: a god, a force, or a philosophy. A god is a powerful being. There we go. A force is some sort of natural or unnatural process which influences the world. A philosophy is an idea or set of ideas that is so compelling that it attracts magical energy and faith to it much as a force does. So basically, the idea being things like, you could theoretically have a force for gravity, and you could for some reason have a priesthood that popped up around it. You can have a god of thunder. You could have people that follow a philosophy of personal improvement. Things, stuff like that. So that is all viable things for faiths. Which figuring out what faiths is in a setting is kind of an important founding thing. So we also have a section here called Ethos and Requirements of the Faith, which basically has codes of behavior, beliefs, and even abilities for their followers. Um, so you gotta figure out, things like, okay, what are the goals of the thing you're worshiping, and how does this, go on? So it has some very basic guidelines here and things like promotion of the god. So almost all of the faiths are going to have a tenet of you're supposed to promote your faith. Um, Obviously there might be a few that don't have that, but for the most part, that's gonna be kind of a universal one. Opposition of enemies, so if you've got like two gods that are opposed to each other, their followers are probably going to be opposed to each other, things like that. All right, so alignment. All right, everybody knows the alignment chart. You got to kind of decide if it's a god, it's going to have an alignment of its own, which will influence, but not necessarily uh, completely restrict the alignment of their followers. So if you have, say, a god of law, it might be my followers. It might be as simple as no chaotic alignments in my followers. So you have all your lawful, you have all your neutral, except for chaotic neutral, obviously. But you have, good neutral evil. Just I'm a god of law. You can't be a you can't be a chaotic alignment. It could be that simple, or it could be lawful alignments only, or it could even be just the specific alignment of the god. If it's just a pure god of law, maybe he's lawful neutral. Only lawful neutral followers. Of course, the restriction itself is usually more demanding for the priesthood than for the followers, generally speaking. Um, doo, doo, doo. Yeah, of course, it goes over some examples here, like God of Love, God of War, things like that. All useful stuff, all useful stuff. Um, Alignments of worshippers. Yep, race is allowed. Ah, yes, that's important too. But race is allowed to follow this god. They might have their favorites. They might even prohibit some. They might be like, I am a god of law, and I don't like those gnomes. Could happen. It's all part of the process. You kind of got to figure out, anytime there's something like that, you kind of got to figure out what does the prohibited race worship in their place? You know, kind of an important thing. Of course, it's got experience and spell progression. Yep, gender requirements. It can happen, especially with things like goddesses of love. Might be like, nope, I only want, certain genders. Or, I mean, heck, a real world example. The Greek goddess Artemis did not like men, did not want male worshippers. Definitely didn't have any, priests, only priestesses. So these are the kind of things you kind of need to take into consideration. Do you want that in your setting? How does that impact the setting if it is there? How does it impact the setting if there aren't any? That can be just as important. All right. Okay, let's see. Duties of the priest. Yep, these are all kind of important. Devotions, ordinary prayers, and rituals that they conduct on a regular basis. So if you've got like a god of the dawn, there's probably going to be some morning rituals that the priest will have to go through, like even while they're on the trail. And obviously, that's the kind of thing that would impact a party. Guidance. Yep. Yeah, that's the kind of thing that you want to pop up on your priest players. NPCs seeking them out for guidance when they're recognized as a priest of whatever god they're part of. Marriages, another one of those things that might be restricted by their particular faith. Missions, yeah, okay. Yeah, of course, the various priesthoods are going to be beholden to their faith. How much structure do they have? That sort of thing. Are they going to be sent out to do things? Are they going to be prohibited from going and doing things? All kinds of stuff that's important. How much, as well as things like how much weight does a particular faith have in a specific kingdom? All important pantheon information. All right. Prophecy and omen reading. Okay. Interesting stuff. Not super important immediately unless you really want to get into it. Vigilance, rights of the trial, rights of the priesthood, church trial, coronation, other thing. Yep. Okay. Tithes, separation from the faith, state religion. Yeah, there might be state religions. It's a thing that can happen. Restrictions on the priest. Yep, of course. Armor. Yeah, okay. Other restrictions that they might have. Specific clothing. Yep. All right. Spheres of influence. This is kind of where you start breaking down the various things themselves. So, generally speaking, here, it's like for the priests, the more spheres of influence they have access to, the weaker their non-magical combat abilities are supposed to be. That's the general guideline it gives here on page 22. Page 22 is where it gives that guidance. And that's important. Like I said, no matter what edition you're, going for, that's good advice. And of course, it's got a bunch of granted powers. It has them broken down between high powers, medium powers, and let's see what it actually calls them, low powers. All right. And it's got basically just a bunch of examples here, but gives the uh, basic guidelines. Yeah, other powers. Just about any spell can be adapted into a priest's granted power. And it, gives some guidelines here as to things like, how, what should be used, what makes good ones, what doesn't, that type of thing. And you got to, determine what your limits on the use are, that sort of thing. Because that's all just a section of examples, is basically what that is. Followers and believers, yep, okay. How many and how strong? Yeah, so that's basically when that's some of the stuff for like later game where your priests are gonna be like building an independent church and start gaining followers, things like that. I think they kind of got rid of that stuff in later editions, but in the early editions, almost all of the classes uh around, I want to say level 12, between like, yeah, I want to say like around level 12 or so, start getting basically NPCs that are followers and henchmen and things of that nature, um that start to follow them around to do things like fighters might get squires and armsmen and things like that. Wizards might attract the occasional apprentice. They, I think, are the ones that got screwed in that department, but considering how powerful wizards are, that's kind of okay. It's a little balanced. Um, Priests get like some junior priests and like some soldiers of the faith, and a bunch of like lesser craftsmen and stuff that are just like followers, things of that nature. Um, Restrictions of force face, rights in the calendar. Yeah, basically talking about you got to have, you know, you got to plan out like religious holidays and stuff for your various gods. All important things. So we were going to, let's see, designing faith. This is still that faith design sheet. Page 39 is the Faith design sheet, if you guys have access. Sample priesthoods. Yep, it's got some samples here. So things like agriculture. You know, ancestors, animals. Yes, it's alphabetical order. There's actually a big, long, holy crap section. Holy crap of sample priesthoods. Where does that end? Page 94. Hang on. Let me go back to where that starts. All right. So, page 40 is the first page of sample priesthoods. Page 94 is the last page of it. It is actually the majority of the book. And that does a lot of work for you, because you could just be like, all right, I need to cover certain things. Like, we have a god of magic. We have a god of healing. We have a god of elemental forces. Oh, pick one. Yeah, all right. So, fire, There's a god of dawn. There's a god of competition, things like that. You could just go through and grab those and just be like, hey, here we go. We've got all this stuff. It's great. This starts talking about priest kits and stuff, and that was never very important for what we're talking about. And then equipment and comic, yeah. So that's the majority of what is useful out of this book. But as you can kind of see, if you're going to be creating from scratch a setting, you kind of need that book. It really just boils down to it, because you gotta figure out what they do. Like, all right, so fear of influence, basically what that ends up making their, what magic their priests end up having. Magic for priests. And I apparently zapped the. There we go. All right. Magic for priests. Yeah, you kind of got to figure that out. All right, so we've got those. Of course, this is also things like religious calendar. I spelled calendar wrong, but whatever. Two kingdoms. Things of that nature. Let's actually kind of put in things like rights and rights and powers. So things like coronations, is there a state religion? If so, they probably have the right of coronation, because it's like, oh, the king is blessed by our god, that sort of thing. The chosen to lead our people, that sort of thing. You get all the kinds of that stuff. So that's all kinds of stuff you need for the Pantheon. And who hates who? Yeah, that's kind of a very important thing, because there's always going to be, gods and goddesses that are in conflict with each other, which will spill over to the priesthoods, which, if there are certain state religions, will spill over onto the kingdoms. So, all right, let's move on. Let's, in fact, go to kingdom. All right. We've got kingdoms. What are we doing with the kingdoms? All right, so for starters, we got to figure out how many. All right. How many? Generally speaking, you kind of want at least one per race, unless a race is broken. Alright, so you got that. You almost always want at least one evil kingdom. That way, you can have characters that are good aligned rogues very simply. It's kind of an important thing to include. You put a evil setting out there, you can have your Robin Hood types. You can have, your lawbreakers that are good aligned very easily. You don't have to try and bend and twist things. It's like, no, they just come from an evil part of the setting. And they're used to just ignoring the law to do what they think is right because that's what they had to do for where they're from. It is it is one of the things you want to do for your players. By the same token, you also don't necessarily want to stop them from playing an evil aligned character if that's what they want to do. Keep in mind that not all evil is, tying, people to the railroad tracks and kicking puppies. You know, for, every Joker out there, there's a Lex Luthor who just wants to, who just wants his version of good because he's the only one that can give it, you know. And for every one of them, there's probably, 50 people who are just out for themselves into neutral evil. Just like, nope, I gotta look out for number one, screw everybody else, and, well, if you can do something for me, maybe, not screw you quite so bad. Things like that, so, at least one evil kingdom. You probably want, um, uh, let's see, at least one evil kingdom. You want at least two in different environments. All right, so what I'm talking about here, at least two good aligned kingdoms in different environments. So you can have your stereotypical fantasy kingdom that's, a good aligned kingdom that, it's rolling plains and dense forests and that's the with a few mountains around the edges, and there's your kingdom. Congratulations. And then you go, all right, now I want another good aligned kingdom. It's in a completely different environment. Nothing like that. So let's go with desert. I like desert. So you have, a desert kingdom. It's a good kingdom. They're good aligned. They have different customs. Life is different in the desert. You could pull on some like Arabic themes if you want, that type of thing. It's a very good example of the desert, lifestyle because, that's, that part of the world, here. So it's a good kind of idea to draw on. So you can have a good aligned desert kingdom, and water is one of the most important things. And you could go, you could even give them the, oh well, we don't necessarily care where you're from so long as you're able to survive here. You prove you have the strength to survive here, therefore you are welcome here. That type of thing. You could go that direction, and who knows, maybe you even pop your evil kingdom. You're at least one. Keep in mind, it's at least one. You can be like, yeah, well, I'm gonna have an evil kingdom in the desert too, or maybe just the kingdom in the desert is the evil, is the evil kingdom, and your other good aligned nation is an island chain out at sea. You know, that's a completely different setting. It's going to be much more focused on the ocean, things like that. Maybe it's far up, up north or far to the south, and it's in like, tundra, conditions, where it's equally harsh, environment, that sort of thing. And then, of course, you have your, like I said, up there's at least the one per race. So you'd be like, okay, so we've got some dwarf. We have a dwarven kingdom. They're probably in the mountains. We'll stick with the stereotypes there, especially since in second ed it's just flat out no, this is how they are. Um, So you got you got there, and you've got like your deep forest for your elven kingdom, and you got some like you got an area for your halflings, and you've got an area for your gnomes, and things like that. And okay, so they all have their own little kingdoms. Maybe they have more than one. you know Things like that. It's all stuff you got to figure out. The thing is you do got to be a little bit careful when you're doing this, because you don't want to put so much in the world that it's overwhelming. So I'd say a good place to be is like, say, give one spot for the gnomes and the halflings each. Right? So you got a halfling kingdom, you got a gnomish kingdom. One or two for the dwarves. Probably a solid two for the elves. That way you can split your like high elves and your wood elves type thing. And then I'd say three kingdoms for the humans. Maybe a couple more if you really want to do stuff. That way you can have your two different environment, good aligned human kingdoms and your one evil human kingdom. And that way, you end up with, well, let's see, that's 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 9 kingdoms. That's a reasonable number. There's enough variation there that as your players travel, if they travel, you're going to see a variety of different, cultures that you can introduce them to and have them all specialize in different things. And that's what creates trade and all that fun stuff, and why they, act the way they do and all that sort of thing. But without being like, there are 400 kingdoms on my world, and be like, okay, well, I'm not going to bother to learn any of them because that's too many. That's how your players will react. If you have too many, that's how they'll react. If you have too few, you're not going to have enough variety in your game. So you gotta kind of hit, like, I'd say 9 to 12. Take a drink real quick. I'd say 9 to 12 ideal number of kingdoms. That way, it's a big enough variety to, sort of have that variety, have that spice of life, have that, variation in locale, but not so many that the players are going to be overwhelmed trying to learn your lore. Because at the very least, all the PCs should be educated enough to know at least a little about each kingdom. All they might know is the commonly known, and you can't see me making the quotes with my hands. They might just know the commonly known stuff like, oh, that kingdom over there is known for their horses, which means they have really good cavalry, and they sell their horses at really high prices. And that's all they know about the kingdom. Maybe that's all they know, unless they're like from there or from some place that is actually bordering them, things like that. Or maybe if they're a scholar, they might know more. Or, some sort of noble where they would need to, keep up with this sort of thing. But you need to make it so that even those little tidbits of knowledge don't overwhelm your players. So you don't want too many, but not too few. So, like I said, 9 to 12, kind of your ideal number on the kingdoms. Let's see. Is there anything else really about the kingdoms that need to be notated? I don't think so. let's talk about the world map a little bit. Even though we lost our ability to actually make it this time around, we're going to still talk about what makes a good world map. So, you ideally, you want at least 2 continents. I'm spelling that wrong. Continents? Two large land masses. And at least 2 island chains. Alright? So, the idea here being you have some place to go over the ocean. It's an excuse to put your players on a boat if they need to go somewhere. And that can be a beautiful thing because combat for PCs on a boat is a hell of a lot different than on land. So, for your fighters, well, you better be darn sure footed and confident in yourself if you're going to wear plate mail. Because if you slip off the edge of that boat, you're going straight to the bottom. Unless you cut yourself out of your plate mail and abandon it. So you're giving all your fighters the option of risking their armor and life by wearing their armor, or by risking their life, or risking their life by not wearing their heavy armor if combat breaks out. So it's a very fun thing, and that's your fighters. That's anybody that can wear heavy armor. Some of the priestly orders, things like that. Your rogues get a very different environment to fight in. Positioning is always very important for rogues, and the flat of a deck is even different from the flat of a field, since the ocean itself is causing the deck to pitch and roll, and there's also the rigging. You got your little thieves climbing up in the rigging and jumping down on people with their knives, You get fun little situations like that. And your wizards? Well, this is probably the one situation where they don't want to throw fireball. You don't want to set your own ship on fire. So, by having some island chains and at least 2 large land masses, you provide the opportunity for the unique environment of fighting on board ship on the high seas. And in addition to that, it also gives natural barriers for separating things. Now, you could go and be like, all right, I have 2 large land masses. Almost all of my kingdoms are on one of them, and the evil part of the setting is the other landmass entirely. They own the entire thing. Which makes it a perfectly good reason why your evil kingdom hasn't taken out the rest of the setting, or the rest of the setting hasn't ganged up and taken out the evil part of the setting. Because they'd have to cross an ocean to do it. You could, instead of that, be like, okay, I've got 2 landmasses. Almost my entire setting is on one of them. The other one is mostly uninhabitable ruins. It's just starting to be reclaimed a little bit by nature, but there was a great war fought over there millennia ago, and the scorched and blackened earth, does not spring forth much life, so people just don't go there. but maybe your PCs need to go there to find some artifacts of great power. You know, something like that. You can set it up that way. Having your island chains gives you, the excuse, to have these smaller cultures. Like even if you don't go with the, like, using an island chain as one of the different environments. One of the like, this is a different environment for a human kingdom, or for a good aligned kingdom of, that sort of thing. Even if you don't do that, you can still have native people to those islands. They're just such a small thing where it's like, all right, there's a community of people on this island, and they have no relations with anybody else from any of the other islands. They're not a kingdom. There's just a town there, if it's even a town. That's a bit different. And it provides the opportunity for that. You could go island to island while you're going somewhere and encounter 5 or 6 different cultures that people didn't have to learn in advance, because they're not these big influential kingdoms. And the reason they exist in these little pockets is the natural barrier created by the ocean. So this is very much a matter of the world map influencing the rest of the setting. And that is another thing you need to keep in mind. Natural barriers. All right, so you got your natural barriers. And like I said, ocean, a very good example of one. You have other things like mountain ranges, which not necessarily as big an obstacle when you have races like dwarves. But they are still very much a natural barrier for most other races. It's like, oh, so there's this forest that's surrounded by mountains. The forest is ruled by the elves because there's like a couple of passes in and out. And, one side of those mountains is, held by dwarves that don't particularly care for the elves, but they're not going to go sally out into the forest the same way that those elves aren't going to go kick down, their great mountain halls. So there's tension, but no open conflict, things like that. And it creates that natural barrier, because maybe on the other side of that mountain that the dwarves are on, is that evil human kingdom that would like nothing more to go kill those tree-hugging elves, but they know they're not going to be able to get through the mountain range. There's no passes that are large enough to pass an army through, and they're not going to be able to go fight hall to hall with the dwarves to get to the elves. So it kind of keeps the peace, just by there being this mountain range in the way. Things like that. Rivers. Rivers make great natural borders as well. They're not as formidable as a mountain or an ocean, but they very much are a thing like because rivers could be as small as the old creek in your old hometown, or as wide as the frickin' Mississippi, where it's a mile across. So you can have two kingdoms across the river from each other. I mean, heck, just here in the real world. You got, the United States on one side of the Detroit River and Canada on the other side of the Detroit River. So, and that's, one of the few parts where Canada deviates from the agreed upon, what's it called? Longitude? Latitude? Yeah, the agreed latitude that they're supposed to follow. Except there, they come down and follow basically where the edge of the lakes and the Detroit River and the Niagara River and out to the ocean. Because there's this natural border there. So so you end up with situations like that. Other natural barriers, obviously, you can have some things like particularly harsh climates, like deserts, and other sorts of like tundra and stuff, where there's just this area where it's difficult to travel. Anything that creates a difficulty in travel could be a marsh. There could be marshlands that cause that create a natural barrier just because you can't get wagons and horses through there, so people don't go that way. And so at the very least ends up creating these like choke points that create these natural like border checkpoints between kingdoms, or you can even have it between counties. You can, because your kingdoms are going to be subdivided into, or oftentimes subdivided into things ruled by lesser nobles. And these same types of natural barriers will create, the exact same borders, but inside a kingdom. You've got a particularly powerful, uh, duchy, let's say, a particularly powerful duchy that's up in the mountains, and they're only real, they've got some farming land in a valley, in a couple of valleys, and there's some mountain passes, and then there's a pass, wider pass that goes out and connects to the remainder of the kingdom. Okay, you can have exactly that. It doesn't have to be that there's an entirely different kingdom there. It can just be a different part of the same kingdom. It's something a little more remote. It's not part of the capital province. It's oh, that is the duchy of so and so, and they are known for their steel. Things like that. Hey, second edition AD&D DM, exactly. But that's the thing. Almost all the stuff I am talking about is stuff that can be applied to any edition, and even things that aren't D&D. Like pretty much any game where you're having to create your own medieval setting, a lot of this stuff applies to. Even stuff that isn't medieval settings, a lot of this stuff applies to. Anything, like you, your world map, your established governments, your religions that are present, any sort of powerful items or important people, the things that are going on. These are all things that you are going to want to have if you are creating a setting of any type. This could even just be for writing a book. Started with second ed and later had to deal with five. Yeah, okay. I'm very similar boat. I started with second and had to deal with third, and there was an incident that basically made it so I'll never play Pathfinder. That came out of that. So yeah, I totally understand that. So natural barriers, yeah, and they could be just about anything, that impedes movement of horses, of wagons, of anything of that nature. Like I said, enough sand will do it. A swath of desert is oftentimes enough excuse to be like, oh yes, our border is over there, somewhere around the edge of that desert. Yes, that that's far enough. We don't care about that place, and it's too hard to get beyond it. So not my problem. So you end up with that. Let's see. Let me shrink this a little more. Maybe you guys, hopefully, you guys will still be able to see it. All right. So natural barriers. You got where your land masses are located. All right. So, kind of a subset here. Fresh water. Can't stress this one enough. So you need your sources of fresh water majorly located in your world map. So this is your lakes, your rivers, your springs, You even can, if you want to get into it, you could even get into groundwater, which, when you have subterranean races, is also very important to keep track of. So you also kind of need to know um, what, basically the types of thing, generalizations about rivers are important to know. Generalizations about water flow are important to know. Things like, you have mountain peaks, you get your snow melt. That's where most rivers start. Is from snow melt. You either get snow melt or you get springs that fill lakes that then drain into rivers. Those are your two sources of rivers. If it's a spring, that means there's groundwater in that location as well. So you need to keep that in mind for your subterranean races. You know, things like that, because that is also going to affect the environment around it. Earliest human civilizations were places like Egypt, where, despite being in the desert, there was the rich, fertile land of the Nile Delta. The Nile was one of the early life-giving rivers. Heck, there are other nearby rivers like the Tigris and the Euphrates that are named by name in particularly old documents. These are important to consider because you're not going to have a kingdom without water. You can have some in deserts, but you're going to almost always have your settlements clustered around oases, or other sources of water. Like, yes, there is a desert here, but the capital of this kingdom is right at the base of a mountain. Yes, I'm teaching. I'm actually, because I have had a little bit of a program failure, I am primarily going to be teaching this stream, and for her duty. I'm going to be primarily teaching this stream and hopefully get the programs and stuff working for next stream, where we'll actually be physically doing the setting. Um, Unfortunately, it was something that happened literally in the middle of the stream, and I could not fix it in a reasonable amount of time, so we're just pressing on with the concepts of world creation. So, yeah, water. You got to have your source of fresh water. So your desert kingdom, it's around an oasis. It's at the base of a mountain where there is some water flow. It's at the rare river that actually passes through the area, and there is greenery around it. It has been a long time since I played Final Fantasy Tactics. I can barely remember it. It was fun, though. I do remember that. Yeah, and that's going to be true no matter the environment. It's just going to be the most obvious in a desert setting because there's going to be very little groundwater in a desert, or at the very least, it's going to be very difficult to get to. So you're not going to have people drilling wells out in the desert with medieval technology. Even with magic, you might have an enterprising wizard that goes out into the desert and magically drills himself a well to set up his mage tower out where nobody can get to him so he can have some damn privacy. Things like that. you know, and that's also kind of a cool thing because that would be something that would stand out, all based on the presence of fresh water or the lack thereof. So it is a very important thing to keep in mind. Like I said, it's a bit less important in other parts of the environment, things like forests and, plains and stuff, but it's still something to keep in mind. No, because when I played Final Fantasy Tactics, I was in my phase where I renamed all the characters, which I think lasted until I played 8. Um, right. Moving on from that, anything else in the world map that needs particular attention? You've got your natural barriers, you got your water, you got your land masses. That's really about the major things you need to focus on the world map, which does lead us, however, directly into important locations. So we are going to want to focus on things like that. Most will be magical in nature. All right, that is literally, let's shrink this a little more. That is literally going to be things like Stonehenge, where, magical rites were performed for centuries. That's going to be, you know, oh, it's going to be your pyramids. It's the tombs of the pharaohs. It's where oh, they're, but beware, they're cursed. Things like that. They're not. I'm not necessarily talking about things like, oh, this is an ancient dungeon and blah 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 blah. No, 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 not that. I'm talking about things that are big, culturally, magically important, that are going to be the type of thing that would be recognized by a kingdom, not just the, oh, there's a bunch of kobolds coming from a hole somewhere over there, and it turns out it's a great big labyrinth. No, 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 not that. Ah, gotta remember to hydrate. All right. I missed the A in magical. Yeah, I don't remember. It has been so long since I played that. It has been way too long since I played that. Of the remainder, be historically important. All right, historically important. I gave an example of this earlier. Things like a particular area, like a mountain pass or something, where there have been hundreds of battles fought because it's the easiest access point between two kingdoms that hate each other, and therefore there are countless numbers of fallen soldiers buried in that pass. Things like that. Or, you know, uh, this maybe it's a giant stone bridge that was built between two kingdoms that joined them, blah blah blah, royal marriage, etc., etc., and this bridge was built to commemorate it, or something like that. About a decade or so ago. Yeah, that's probably about the same as me. Maybe 2 decades in my case. Um, what are you meowing about, cat? Go away. I'm busy. Roommate's cat bothering me again. All right. Um. Yeah, I do remember restarting that game a lot. Um. Yeah, historical importance. Which might not necessarily seem like much, but it is the kind of thing that you can have stuff that's going on at. So you could have your, Stonehenge type circle, and there's some evil cult that's going to make use of it to do some sort of thing. You could have your big politically important bridge that someone has decided to destroy to make a point. Things like that. So having those important locations tying into the things that are happening can be very important. Or even lesser stuff like celebrations. You can have minor conflicts. Making nobles and finding use for them besides simply being rich, pompous pricks. Yep, we're gonna get to that when we get to notable individuals. Um, um, there very much are ways to do that. Generally, All right, so you can have ones that very much are. That is very much a trope for a reason. You can simply have good aligned ones that are just using their position of nobility to advance the interests of the kingdom and the people in it. You know, those people exist too. You know, maybe they are genuinely good people. Maybe they are people who just realize that that's the best way to go about things to keep themselves on top. Either way, you end up with the same result. What makes them noble in the first place? Well, that is fairly easy in a fantasy setting. Um, Nobles and royalty are uh, generally considered to be appointed by their gods. You know, you often have a state religion. We actually kind of covered this up in the pantheon section, but I think you might have came in after that. You'll have your appointed by the gods ruler, and yeah, sometimes that'll extend to the nobility as well. Other times it'll just be these were the people that supported the first king, and therefore their families are the nobles, that sort of thing. You got to remember, nobility generally follows family lines, although there are created nobles as well. Landed knights, things of that nature were very common. Sometimes the title would pass on to their children, sometimes it wouldn't in those cases. Usually anything uh, that was a baron or larger was generally a inheritable title. So you could have a baron, you could have a count, you could have a duke. They would all, pass their title on to their kids, unless, of course, usually it would be their firstborn son would usually be the one that would get the title. Um, you know, having was it an heir, a spare, and a daughter was the old axiom. That way, you had an heir, you had a second son in case something happened to the heir, and then you had a daughter so that you could give a have a political marriage. That was the old axiom, and you can very much stick to that with the nobles that you have. They're gonna have families unless you're very specifically going to have one that's looking for a wife and doesn't have a family yet. That could even be a plot point. You know, Generally a good idea to be vague about how their family became noble, or should their beginnings be mentioned? So you can do a mix. Some of them, generally speaking, you want your common populace, so the common knowledge, will generally be kind of vague. It might be something like, oh, they supported King such and such the second in such and such conflict, and he ennobled them. And they have done the ever since. So, maybe they will know that, or heck, dumb peasant might be like, oh yeah, I know they helped out the king, so they helped out a king sometime back, and they gave them their nobility. So the common level knowledge is often going to be vague unless it is something within a generation or two. But the more nobly inclined or the scholarly inclined will probably have more detailed information. So that same noble, where it was, oh, he gave assistance to such and such the second during such and such conflict, they might know, oh yes, that particular noble line's ancestor ran a blockade, brought a vessel full of foodstuffs and supplies to break a siege during this particular campaign in this war, and that's why he was ennobled for his bravery. It could be, you can be very specifically that, things of that nature. Um, and just because one guy was good doesn't necessarily mean, his descendants are. So you can have your evil nobles, even in a good setting. They're just usually going to be like lawful evil, you know. They'll be like, all right, how do I use the law to get my own ends? You can have your neutral nobles who are like, yeah, this is my position in life. I'm going to do the things I'm required to do. Uh, but I'm not particularly looking to improve anybody's situation. I'm not looking to make anybody's life any harder. I just kind of do what I have to do and get going. You can have your you can have even some generally good aligned ones where a varying scale there, because you can have the ones that are very proactive. I am going to make life better for everybody under my rule, and in the process make my area more prosperous for the kingdom and improve everybody's life. Or you could have the good noble that is just the I do what I can for I do what I can to make myself more prosperous, which in the process means enriching my people and my kingdom. Kind of a more laid back and little amount of self interest in it, version. Small things to big things that can net them their position. Exactly. It's really a matter of the ruler at the time they were ennobled and what they did for them, or what they perceived was done for them. Because some stuff might, not have actually happened. Some stuff might have been blown out of proportion. There's an old Disney cartoon, for example, where there's a king being told that there's a giant, coming into the kingdom, and the Mickey Mouse character had just swung a fly swatter around and killed 7 flies, and was running around telling people he killed 7 in one blow, killed 7. And the king heard, when they were talking about giants, they heard him say, "Oh, I killed 7 in one blow." It's like, oh, then you're the perfect person to go take care of this giant, because it was a big misunderstanding. You know, it could even be something like that. There was a misunderstanding, generations ago, and somebody faked it till they made it. So promised positions of power if they helped another heir achieve the throne. That's something that can happen too. Like I said, it's a matter of who's the ruler that ennobled them, and what did they do for them. So in some cases, that is, they helped them get the throne in the first place. And now there are other ways that this type of thing can happen as well, because you might have a royalty that wasn't the anointed by their god, especially when you get to like your evil kingdoms. It might be, no, I was the strongest, baddest ass mofo around, and I killed everybody in my way till everybody that was left agreed I was in charge. Yeah, it really is much simpler than it really is. It's all about what did their ancestor, or maybe them, do to help out the ruler that ennobled them. That's really all it is. And what level of, exaggeration may or may not have been involved. How much has that story grown since then, or faded away into obscurity since then? So that's really all there is to the nobles, because the nobles, you can just treat them as any other NPC, except that they wield political power and influence. That's it. What are their goals? Yeah, well, glad I could help. Yeah, it's really a matter of, for every NPC, what you need to do. And this is one of the things that I was going to get into about the common pitfalls that happen to DMs, is they try to tell a story rather than manage a setting. Because what the DM really should be doing is managing a setting and letting the players tell the story. The thing that that should be thought about most is, what do the NPCs want? What does each NPC desire? And how are they likely to go about trying to get it? So we'll kind of go with the Aladdin example. The Jafar is the evil, court vizier. How is he gonna go about fulfilling his ambition of becoming sultan? And this is what the NPC is going to do, barring influence, barring the actions of the PCs. This should never be anything world-ending, but it might change your setting a bit. If he ends up being successful, involves playing a noble lord to manage an entire region, was hung up on how the nobles rate. Oh, okay, yeah, cool. But yeah, the motivation is, how is this evil vizier going to go about trying to become sultan? And then at what, basically try and figure out how will he react if he gets thwarted in various ways by the PCs. His goal's not going to change. He might have to change how he goes about it. That sort of thing. And what happens if the PCs don't get involved at all? This is always something you need to keep in mind. What happens if, in this particular instance, what if Aladdin didn't take the bait and go to the Cave of Wonder? Well, we kind of know where that one was going. Instead of using the power of the genie to take over the sultanship, it's like, oh, well, I've found this old law that says if a suitable prince can't be found for the princess, then she has to marry the royal vizier. The plan changed. The goal was still the same. So if, hadn't been involved at all, that's exactly the direction it would have gone. So this is always the kind of thing you need to think about, is what happens if the PCs do nothing? Check to learn nobles. Most are super lazy, leaving everything to their subjects. Very rarely doing anything good for their people unless it really benefited. That's very much a thing. Although you also have to keep in mind that most of them were most of them were the type of lazy that realized that doing too little would risk their position. So they would usually do just enough to get by, which often involved finding competent minions. You have a seneschal. Let's use that one for term. I could have said a housecarl or a seneschal or a vizier. There were always different names for basically the trusted advisor that was also given power to see to the day-to-day things. A retainer of some sort, yes. And there might be more than one. Some form of, he is the count's man, let's say, it's a count, who, people know, oh, he's here on the count's business, and he would find competent people, or at least, people who were seemingly competent, to go and do the job for them. Just report back to me later. Yes. Oh, see to it. So they would still be lazy, but their jobs were still getting done because they delegated. They were usually smart enough to delegate. And it was only the really, really bad ones, or the ones who trusted the wrong people, that really really got knocked down for that being lazy and incompetent, which was known to happen. But most of the people who would be retainers to these people realized that their position kind of relied on them doing at least a passable job. So most of them would do their best to be competent or to hide anything they were doing as best they could. Military arms of nobles, people handling, protecting. Uh, in many cases, yes. There were also ones that were directly responsible for their household. So it would be things like ensuring that there was enough food on hand, manage the cooks, manage the maids. There was actually. Hold on a second, I gotta take a drink. So there is an old position that the actual name of the position was the Batman, which is a word that eventually morphed into butler. So, what the Batman did was see to the needs of the noble and his household. So, it would involve everything from making sure that the noble was properly dressed to making sure the maids were doing their jobs and the cooks were doing their jobs and all of the deliveries came in on time, the correct amounts of stuff were purchased, all that sorts of things. So, you kind of think about it, to continue the Batman reference, think about what Alfred does for Bruce Wayne. Yeah, it actually is a medieval term. And, like I said, it eventually morphed into butler. And the responsibilities obviously were diminished as, it simply became elite upper class rather than nobility. But it's the same basic idea. There is someone who makes sure that all the day-to-day operations are seen to and only bothers his superior if it is something sufficiently out of the ordinary. So almost all of them would have someone of that nature. And like I said, seneschal was another term that was often used for such a thing. Although that was more of a general second in command type position, where they could be also in charge of their military arm, but they often usually just had a military person for that. Um, and that was all the sorts of things that kind of went on. So you could have a incredibly lazy and like fairly stupid noble that had enough competent people around him that he was remembered well. And you could have some fairly smart, well intending, nobles that just had poor choice in people and had things fall apart on them. Because it's kind of one of those. It's not what you know; it's who you know. That was as true back then as it is now. So it's all very, very important stuff because and that's the thing is almost all nobles have their court and their courtiers, and all the important people that are surrounding the most important person in the area, and it's the kind of thing you always need to remember anytime anytime a PC ends up at that type of location, anytime they are interacting with nobility or anyone of that nature, is they are going to be surrounded by other individuals that all have their little areas of power and will probably be jealously guarding them and trying to figure out what can you do to make me look good? Game of Thrones Bannerman. Sort of. So they were other landed nobles. So it was so you would have like the Starks, who were, because since the North was considered a kingdom, and then like it was very poorly said how there was the Seven Kingdoms. That was basically an empire. Their ruler should have been called an emperor. Um, if it was going to be, because an empire is generally a collection of kingdoms, but effectively King of the North, the Starks, were effectively the royal household, and then the Karstarks and the Boltons and stuff were other landed nobles. Is basically how that would kind of go. But if you recall, there were like the maesters and such that were the advisors and things of that nature to all the various nobles. That would be more like more what I'm talking about would be more like the maesters, where not except without the loyalty to a larger order. So it would actually be more like the King's Council, down in why was my brain in the Red Keep? Down there, where it's the Hand of the King. Yeah, King's Landing. There you go. That was what I was trying to remember. Like there was the Hand of the King, and the Master of Coin, and the Master of Whispers, where there was the king, and then there was this council of people that all oversaw certain things, and theoretically, it was the king would sit down and listen to the council give their reports, and if he needed them to do any sort of specific thing, or if they needed advice from him, that's when it would happen, and then they would go out and carry out their various responsibilities without a lot of influence from the king, unless the king particularly wanted it. But that sort of thing is basically what would happen at every noble level. Is there would be a handful of people who had these responsibilities that would see to them, on behalf of the noble, without the noble having to do everything themselves. And this was considered normal. So if there were particularly lazy nobles, then people didn't necessarily notice as long as their people were competent. That's just kind of how it ends up going. And actually, with that, I think I am about done for the evening. I am going to try and get the campaign cartographer working right. It really does bother me that wasn't working right. I'm going to see if I can fix it. And we will save this. I'm, in fact, going to go right here and go save, bam. All right. We have saved our document, so I'll know right where we have left off. We will continue next time. We will get through the last few little things here on the possibilities of where to start the setting, but you got to go through all of them in order to get your setting done. And hopefully we will be able to do our world map and start setting up our kingdoms and maybe our pantheon. Next time here. A nightmare program. I'm using Campaign Cartographer 3, which was fairly simple. Wonder Draft? Never heard of that one. I might have to look into it. No, it had just been too long, and I might have corrupted some parts of the files. I have to check it over, but it was not something I could fix quickly. And it's the one I'm used to, is ultimately what it boils down to. You could use whatever mapping program you want. You could do it in Paint if you need to. The exact program you use isn't important so long as you can make a map where you can tell what everything is. But we're going to come back over here. Boop. Just like that. We're going to very quickly put back on this guy, because I forgot to do that. And I think we are going to call it a night. It has been about 2.5 hours I've been on. I said I was going to do between 2 and 3. My throat is starting to hurt, despite regularly hydrating. So we will be back next time. This seems to have been a moderately successful stream here. We'll be back next time, hopefully to actually start working on a specific setting rather than just going over generalizations. Although we will finish our generalizations before doing so. Let me see. Is there... Okay, there is not anybody on I am feeling comfortable rating, so I will just wish you guys a good night and see you next time. I still don't know how to end a stream. Later.